Hello there. I hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk with you about white-collar and corporate crime from Clinard and Meyer's book, and this is Chapter 7. White-collar crime refers to offenses committed by workers in the course of their commercial activities. It's called white-collar because that's what people wear traditionally in higher-level businesses or managerial positions. And white-collar crime is not confined only to the actions of individuals, but also to those companies and corporations. Corporate crimes are offenses that involve entire firms or industries, instead of crimes being committed by specific individuals. The consequences of white-collar crime are serious, and there are several examples in your book of some devastating corporate crimes. And some examples that they have here on your overhead: tax violations, embezzlement, fraud, expense account misuse, illegal campaign contributions, as well as bribery. There's some discussion in the text about computer crime, and this is of increasing concern to law enforcement and everyday citizens. There's been an increase in the reliance on computers and technology for conducting business and almost every aspect of our daily lives. Computer crimes can occur from any location where there's internet access and can occur at any time of hour and any day of the week. Enforcing computer crime is a problem because traditional police methods do not effectively detect and investigate such crimes. So as the technology has emerged, the need to find ways for people in police departments and other forms of criminal detection to do their work. If you're doing a brief history of this type of crime, you can look at the first Roman notion of caveat emptor, which means let the buyer beware. So in this instance, the idea is that somebody could sell something to somebody, and if they get ripped off, well, it was really in part the buyer's fault because they weren't doing due diligence. The early 19th century brought about the fear of monopolies because those placed too much power in the hands of just one company. And so you had the development of, as it says, the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1895. And that was in order to prohibit economic monopolies. It says here, the pattern of anti-monopolization seen 100 years ago continues to the present day. The federal government has intervened in a number of cases where monopolization was possible. In the 1990s, the U.S. Justice Department took Microsoft to court because it said the company was monopolizing internet web browsing business with its Internet Explorer product. Only one example they mention there. Let's review a quick question here. The blank is a regulatory law that is enforced by a special agency of the federal government, the Federal Trade Commission. Which of the following is true? A. We just talked a little about that, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Regarding that question, the Sherman Act is a regulatory law enforced by a special agency of the federal government, which is the FTC. Legislation through the 1900s located white-collar and corporate crime in administrative and regulatory law. Another question you can consider: who coined the term white-collar crime? I'll give you a hint. It's a guy from a previous chapter we talked about who came from Gibbon, Nebraska. His name? Edwin Sutherland. If you define this term, white-collar crime refers to a type of crime committed by persons during the course of their occupations. So during the course of their job, their employment. Victims of white-collar crime are not only consumers who buy faulty products, say, or who pay more for services than desirable, but they are found throughout the class system and in all regions. Initial definitions of white-collar crime that Sutherland devised intrigued him because he was able to do two things. First, distinguish white-collar crime from ordinary or street crimes. This was a separate typology or category of crime that deserved what he thought were special investigations. And that's the second point. White-collar criminals were not needy criminals who committed these crimes out of necessity. So what drove those people's criminal activity? This is what interested Sutherland. The study of white-collar crime now is about 75 years old, according to your textbook. Alternative research in white-collar crime viewed the crime in more behavioral terms, which focused more on the nature of the crime and not on the criminal. The criminal event perspective, by contrast, examines white-collar crime through the study of the offender, the victim, and the context in which the crime takes place. So you can contrast those two notions, the idea of viewing the crime in behavioral terms versus the criminal event perspective. Occupation. The occupational dimension of white-collar crime involves a special status. So part of what is being violated when a white-collar crime occurs is the idea that the person's powerful and that others trust them, and that that individual is identified also in those ways. However, offenders can be professional or non-professional. Basically, to qualify as occupational white-collar crime, it's really important for the crime to occur within any legitimate occupation. Regarding law, white-collar deviance, and this is a specific term in your textbook, is an inclusive approach that examines a wider range of acts. But it's weak in describing what constitutes white-collar and corporate wrongs. It says, a broad view of white-collar crimes includes both illegal and immoral acts. Fraud is a crime, and it refers to the use of deception for unlawful gain, whether that be in the form of money, power, or position. Not all frauds are example of white-collar crime, but most white-collar crimes are examples of fraud. Fraudulent behavior associated with white-collar crime has an additional component. It is committed from a position of trust afforded the offender by occupying a legitimate occupation. So the person has the legitimate occupation first, and then comes their crime. Power or trust, I just talked about in the previous slide. White-collar crimes are often considered crimes where a person's power is abused, and those who are in a position of power or trust are typically considered respectable. So the idea is that this type of crime not only harms the individual, but it shows that companies may not be able to be trusted. Respectable is characterized as someone's personal characteristics or appearance of trust and honesty. So there's a major violation of power and trust when some of these crimes occur and the individuals are found. Corporate crimes, as criminal acts, are not individual specific. Corporate crimes are focused on collections of people, such as corporations, organizations, and their management. As an example, some members of leadership within an organization may participate in insider trading by providing information to outside sources about decisions that will impact stock prices. In your text, there's some mention of various individuals who use the stock market for illicit gains. It even talks about, let's see, now let's consider corporate criminal behavior. Corporate crimes, as criminal acts, are not individual specific. These are focused on collections of people, and those can be corporations, organizations, and their management. For example, some members of leadership within an organization may participate in insider trading by providing information to outside sources about decisions that will impact stock prices. And there's an example of this in your textbook related to Martha Stewart. A key case of white-collar crime in the 21st century involved a company called Enron. Enron deceived shareholders into believing that the company was worth more than it was. The company claimed this, the government found out, and then the company's accounting firm, Arthur Andersen, attempted to shred documents to reduce the evidence of their involvement. And this is discussed in your textbook under the turbulent 21st century here. It said an investigation surrounding off-the-book partnerships used to deflate debt and inflate profits. So if you want more information, there's a good paragraph length on this type of crime and Enron's involvement. Also, there's information about WorldCom. The accounting technique of what's called capitalized costs was how WorldCom improperly accounted for a $3.9 billion in costs, an insane amount of money. So briefly, capitalized costs is where the company pays costs, but those costs are not included on the income statement, which makes the company's net income higher because they aren't reduced by the costs. It's a little hard to follow, but I promise you, if you read in your textbook about this, there's a very detailed paragraph that can help you navigate that information. If you talk about the nature and types of corporate crimes, the largest theft in the United States involved the collective embezzlement in the saving and loan industry, and that ultimately will cost taxpayers and the U.S. government between $300 and $500 billion. So $500 billion is a remarkable sum. And there's also a brief discussion of technocrime. It's the use of computers, fax machines, cell phones, electronic surveillance, and new accounting technologies in the commission of crime. Crimes against consumers include manufacturers who make unsafe products, retailers who take unfair advantage of customers in purchasing products, and repair specialists who swindle customers in the repair of products. Crimes against owners. These are generally committed by people within the organization who have knowledge of organizational practices and how to get around rules and regulations governing organizational behavior. Crimes can be directed against the owners of the companies or against the management and senior leaders of the organization. Some examples include falsifying annual reports or other documents to misrepresent the financial success or failure of a company. Police officers and agencies are not adequately trained to monitor or detect these types of crimes. These are difficult crimes to get to the bottom of. Therefore, like most white-collar crime and corporate crime, these offenses are generally brought to attention by what are called whistleblowers, people inside of those organizations or companies who then report the fraud or the crime. It says whistleblowers are individuals with the technical training noticing things are not as they should be, and they decide to turn in the offenders. So other forms of whistleblowing could be people who, for example, look at the books of a company and say, oh, this isn't right, and then they turn those people in, that company in. Crimes against employees is another category. Companies can commit crimes against their employees when they deliberately violate health and safety laws, OSHA law, or fail to take adequate precautions against employee injury. And again, at the bottom, the OSHA, Office of Occupational Safety and Health Administration, is the federal agency that's responsible for maintaining safe working conditions, such as not having asbestos, not being in situations that might cause you bodily harm or injury, or other forms of damage to your body. Also, under the nature and types of corporate violations, you find crimes against employees. So companies can commit crimes against their employees when they deliberately violate things like health and safety laws, laws that protect the employee through health and safety, or they failed to take adequate precautions against employee injury. The Office of Occupational Safety and Health Administration, otherwise known as OSHA, is the federal agency responsible for maintaining safe working conditions. Crimes against the community at large, that's another type of corporate violation. And we're all the victims of abuses of power when we breathe in polluted air or drink or use polluted water. Other examples of this could include government scandals, like the Watergate scandal in Washington, D.C., which involved conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and lying under oath, all of which brought down President Nixon. He was impeached and then removed from office. Actually, he didn't get removed from office, he resigned. This crime not only identified corruption within the government, but it also cost the taxpayers money because there were investigation and court hearings which cost a fortune. Both white-collar and corporate crimes can overlap in terms of the victims. So this can include victims like shareholders, customers, employees, and the community, all within a single crime. Crimes victimizing stockholders, workers, customers, consumers, and an entire region have come to be known as what's called the Enronization of corporate criminality. And this is the work of one of the authors of your textbook. Professional crime and deviance amounts to the misconduct of people performing professional rather than occupational roles. So here's the difference. Examples of professionals would include physicians, lawyers, clergy, college professors. The clergy scandal mentioned in your text, it's discussing two issues, one of which was fraud and the idea that there were televangelists who were taking advantage of people. So reports of, it said, financial and personal scandals include, first, Oral Roberts raising $8 million because he claimed that God would take his life if he did not raise the money by April. A couple of others that they mentioned, Jim Baker, who had a sex scandal and questions of financial impropriety leveled at him. And Jimmy Swaggart also faced accusation of sexual improprieties with a prostitute. So those are more forms of deviance in some cases than actual crime. The second one listed on the slide, though, is definitely crime. Clergy sexually molesting young boys. And the Catholic Church has been dealing with this and facing this charge and its repercussions for quite a number of years now. White-collar crimes are sophisticated, and they're the result of considerable planning. These are not occasional crimes or one-offs. These are things that take planning and preparation, and for that reason, the second bullet, these crimes are oftentimes committed by offenders who should know better. They had to know what they were doing very, very clearly before they did them, so they should have known better. They were very consciously engaged in crime. This involves sophistication. White-collar crimes require knowledge of the occupational and legal context and training in economics, in the operation of the stock market, in the law, and in law enforcement. Insider trading requires an individual to know how the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, defines and monitors this crime, how the laws are enforced, who enforces them, and the likelihood that he or she will be caught. So they're doing a lot of calculations with a lot of information when committing such crimes. They involve then planning. White-collar offenders are meticulous about planning their crimes because they anticipate actions and reactions of victims and the police. Because the crimes are often complicated to perform, the offenders calculate the risks and try to account for all the possibilities of being caught in order to reduce their chances of being detected. The self-concept of these individuals, those who commit white-collar crimes, regard themselves as respectable citizens, not as criminals. because their offenses take place in connection with legitimate operations. So there's a kind of blurry thing going on in their mind, and they don't see themselves, again, as criminals. White-collar offenders also tend to have a high social standing compared to that of conventional criminals, which also plays into their self-concept. Cressy identified embezzlers as trusted people who stole organizational funds as a result of three conditions. The first, those were individuals who faced an unshareable financial problem. So they began to think of how to solve that problem and how they discovered the idea of embezzling to solve their own cash-strapped situation. Second, they recognized the chance to solve their financial problem by violating the position of financial trust, what I just mentioned. And third, developed suitable Cressy, in 1953, identified embezzlers as trusted people who stole organizational funds as a result of three things. First, they faced an unshareable financial problem. It seemed to be their problem, and they couldn't ask for other people to help him or her out. They recognized the chance to solve that financial problem by violating their position of financial trust. And then third, developed suitable rationalizations for embezzling to resolve their self-conceptions as trusted people. White-collar offenders are different than some of the ones we've talked about in previous chapters. They do not have an extensive record of juvenile misbehavior, juvenile court appearances, records of conventional crime as adults, or histories of association with conventional criminals. Some white-collar offenders have extensive histories, though, of white-collar criminality. So they may have been doing that particular type of crime for a long time. And that's the example. Falsifying corporate records to mislead stockholders can take place over a number of years. Number 4, I hope, is a pretty easy question for you. What's the usual motive of white-collar criminals? The answer? Money, 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 money. As said in the slide, white-collar criminals are in it for the buck. They're in it for profit. And it requires a combination of both opportunity and learning environments. So they have to learn how they might take advantage of a situation and steal. So Coleman discussed 3 factors related to this. First, the idea of motivation. Second, those who commit the crimes, culturally learned neutralizations have to be taken in so that they can distance themselves from the crime. And then, as I said a minute ago, the opportunity has to present itself. Occupational criminals learn techniques as well as rationalizations, norms, and attitudes associated with their offenses. So this is harking back to the work of Sutherland when he talked about the ideas of how people learn crime. Characteristics that isolate people in business occupations from unfavorable definitions of illegal activities. So things like mass media, high status occupations, as well as associations with peers. There are 3 big costs that are associated with white-collar and corporate crime. And those would be first, financial, second, physical costs, and third, social costs. Let's talk about financial harm first. Recent cost estimates for white-collar crimes and corporate crimes is that they cost between $425 billion and $1.7 trillion a year. Unfathomable numbers. Examples of these can include all sorts of things: price fixing, fraudulent sales, illegal financial manipulations, issuing fraudulent securities, income tax violations, misuse of patents, illegal rebates, unfair labor practices, and political bribery. So a huge number of different things can fall under the idea of corporate crime and the very, very deep costs of these things, the financial harm. Physical harm. This is directed toward employees of offending firms, customers, and the community at large. So physical harm toward employees could include unsafe work conditions. Physical harm toward customers would include the sale of unsafe products. And physical harm toward the community at large would involve polluting the air, the water, and creating unnecessary noise pollution. Social costs or damages to the moral climate are also important to consider. White-collar crimes violate trust, and therefore they create distrust. And this has a larger harmful effect, lowering social morale, and also producing disorganization within a society. Observers who see high social standing citizens committing white-collar crimes creates a sense of cynicism and fosters the attitude that if others are doing it, I might as well too. The negative impact of abuses of power on our trust in one another assumes a couple things. First, high-status persons serve as a moral role model, if you will, for the rest of the population. You would be surprised if you heard that, for example, Steve Jobs was engaged in crime, and he has not been. But again, as a major figure in the media, that would shake a lot of people. The rest of the population patterns their behavior after those that they emulate. So people who are seen as successful in business are seen as people to be emulated, and if they're criminal, this causes a ripple effect in terms of people's feelings of You can also consider the negative impacts of abuses of power on our trust in one another. So there's a couple of assumptions I want to discuss with you here. First, high-status persons, you know, they serve as moral role models for the rest of the population. So we look at people like Bill Gates, like Steve Jobs, as heroic, as entrepreneurs. If it came to be found out that they had engaged in a series of criminal activities, which, by the way, neither of them have been, that, though, would shake public confidence and probably challenge people's sense of understanding what good practices are and what people might do to get ahead. So people pattern their behaviors after those that they see as the role model, and the public generally views abuses of power as relatively serious, at least compared with street crime. Unethical business practices and law violations may be attributed to the company's internal structure. So there can be a company culture of being tolerant of unethical or illegal acts, as reflected in the conduct of top executives. So if the people in the top are saying, do these illegal things, that can go through the entire organization and permeate business as usual. A structure of decision-making can also distort responsibility for decisions. This means that, again, the people underneath, people who are higher ups, will be perhaps encouraged to do things they might never otherwise do. Control of white-collar and corporate crime requires both criminal law and administrative law. Criminal law, first, supports that illegal behavior should be punished and that criminal sanctions should be punitive in order to achieve certain desired ends, for example, deterrence, rehabilitation, and retribution. Administrative sanctions are different. They seek to obtain compliance from offenders, not to always punish them for wrongdoing. And it's an important distinction we'll talk about a little more. The object of administrative law is compliance. You want people to follow the law. Offenders may be given then an injunction or a legal order to terminate an action. So as an example I have here, a manufacturing plant that pollutes a river may be given an injunction to stop the action, and then no further penalties will be administered if they stop. A review question for you. Which of the following are not measures used to help reduce future instances of white-collar and corporate crime? Take a look and see what you think. Probably the answer is D. The other three sound like very good ways to reduce future instances of white-collar and corporate crime. So let's talk about them for a minute. Measures used to help reduce future instances of white-collar and corporate crime are things, as mentioned, public education, developing stronger business ethics, legislation, and using publicity to change corporate behavior. Each of these I'll discuss in a little more depth now. Under public education, many cases of white-collar crime and corporate crime could be reduced if individuals were educated about the crimes, therefore reducing the chance of their own victimization. So if you know about law, then you're more likely to know when law is being violated. Public education is also necessary in order to press for other changes, such as increased penalties for offenders. Greater public awareness of abuses of power could lead to moving up these offenses on the public's crime agenda for stronger enforcement and sentencing. If you want to increase ethical behavior in the workplace, some suggestions. The best way to curtail abuses of power is to persuade those in positions of power to not engage in abuses of power. Don't do it. If you encourage those people, that helps set a norm. This can involve educating employees about behaviors that are not accepted within the organization and clearly identifying the consequences for engaging in these undesirable behaviors. You could also provide or mandate ethics training courses. We have to do those at UNK involving research. If we want to do research on human subjects, we have to take a course on ethics, as an example. You can also sanction unethical employees in order to change their behavior. Legislative reforms are also possible, and two forms are discussed in your book. Increase in the number of abuses of power that would be incorporated into the criminal law. So you can adjust the criminal law in that manner. You can also have the creation of more stringent penalties for those abuses of power that are now currently in criminal law. Legislative reforms should not be limited to reforms that increase the criminalization of abuses of power. Instead, fewer regulations would be easier to enforce with perhaps more biting penalties. So reduce the number of regulations and increase the penalties. That might have a greater effect than our present system of administrative and criminal laws and penalties. That said, government regulation of some kind is a necessary part of any system of control over abuses of power. There needs to be government regulation in order to stop abuses of power. Civil penalties can also be appropriate for corporate abuses. And for people who feel they have been wronged, they can also sue a corporation in civil court. So, white-collar corporate crime, a very emergent form of crime that is very, very costly to society,